All right. Well, welcome, Oley Dibba-Wadda. Thank you so much for taking time to spend with us here at Luminos. As you know, we are in the process of engaging in conversations with education leaders and leaders in general, in fact, like yourselves, who have played some role in helping education systems think their way through crisis. And so, again, welcome to you. Thank you for taking time with us. Perhaps we'll start at the beginning, Oley. Tell us about your childhood and tell us how your own education may have influenced the path that you took as you became an adult.
My childhood, I was always someone who got into trouble for giving. I can remember a lot of my childhood of coming back home and getting into trouble because I was always taking from home and, food, going into the refrigerator, sneaking out food, giving to our neighbors and coming back and getting into trouble for it. And, my parents would travel, come back, get nice outfits, clothes, and I take it and give it away and say, my mom said I should give this to you. I don't know why I was doing that at the time, but every time I did that, I knew I would get in trouble, but I still did it. And it took me literally 30 up to the age of 40 to really make sense of why I was doing this, why I was always giving, trying to please, feeling that, I was surrounded by a lot of people who didn't have, and I was privileged. My dad worked in the international communities and we traveled none of it made sense to me until now. And then when I was trying to put my memoirs together, everything started pouring in, and with conversations with my parents, and it dawned, and my mom said to me, "You're always giving. I mean, to your detriment. Everything you had, you gave away." And I realized that was what my passion and purpose was always helping out, giving out. Being very empathic. I'm like a sponge. I just absorb other people's emotions and feelings and what they go through, and trying to put myself in those people's shoes. And I still do that now with even my house help, and I get in trouble with my husband, and he's like, you need to set some boundaries. So I guess this is just who I am. And then going to school as well, it was the same. I did my primary and higher education in the Gambia and then moved to the UK. And that's where I went to college, went to university. And so that's been my life. But, in terms of education, it was never an issue for me. It was the question of going to school or not going to school was never an issue. It was going to school was a must. It was like waking up in the morning and brushing your teeth. So, and I have one brother and 2 sisters, and there was never an issue of whether it was, we had to go to school or not, or compromise because we were girls or so on. And it wasn't until I went into my professional career that I saw the marginalizations, or those things started making sense to me, especially in the areas of girls' education and gender inequities.
So speaking of gender and women and girls, it appears that you at some point in your academic journey, you studied gender. Yes. And then in your international development work, there's been a lens, at least, on women and girls. Could you explain why?
Going into gender happened by default. It was the other way around. When I was working in the Gambia here for the Support to Decentralized Rural Development Program. And I remembered I was working in the administration area, and every time we went on trek, especially on community development work, I was the only female. And when we had meetings, they always said I should be the ones to take notes, and I rejected it. And they were like, but you are the only woman here. So every time we went, I rejected, or they said, oh, you do this because you're the only one who's a woman here, especially when the management team was meeting. And in the end, they started teasing me, gender woman, gender woman. It still wasn't, you know, I still didn't see myself as that activist or advocate for gender equality. I just felt it wasn't right at the time. And then there was a course that was ongoing here at the Management Development Institute. And my boss said to me, I think it would be good for you to do something on gender and gender inequalities, because every time we went to these communities, you always picked on the subtle things that the women went through or what they said without even realizing it. And this was a program that we were looking on decentralizing everything that was happening in communities as well. And so I went and did the course, and that was it. I just got absorbed in it. I ended up doing my master's, and that was not enough. And I started off my PhD looking at trying to understand gender and gender inequalities, and and its values or its importance in African communities. Now, I didn't finish it. I didn't complete it because I got a job outside of the UK, and I moved to Nairobi. But during that time, I worked with Oxfam GB as a global advisor on gender inequalities, and partly also working on gender, on providing advice on gender in humanitarian setting, but that was temporary. And then I worked also with the Commonwealth Education Fund that was looking at education programs and to ensure that gender inequalities were addressed across 16 Commonwealth countries across the continent. And the more I went in, the more I just saw things that I didn't realize was happening in the outside world. And I think for me, my biggest aha moment was when I moved to Nairobi, working for the Forum for African Women Educationalists, FAWE, that focused on girls' education. And my first experience of really firsthand, experiencing inequities on girls' education was with FAWE. And that was the turning point of not ever going back in terms of girls' education for me.
So let's dig deeper. From the subtle, joking inequality that you faced with your colleagues who weren't taking you seriously and calling you the gender person, to your time at FAWE and really getting under the bonnet, if you like, of inequality as it relates to girls and education in general. What are we missing as a society? Why is gender inequality a thing?
Mm-hmm. I think one, it's related to poverty, and I'll still come back to the FAWE experience. What had happened was we went to Kajiado to visit one of the FAWE centers of excellence. And we saw 3 young girls with, I assume they were with their mothers and a gentleman. And they were walking, it was very, very hot then. And they were walking across whilst we were visiting the center. And when I got to the center, and they had just left the school. And when we got to the school, it was a safe house for girls. And I said, oh, did you have a PTA or something? Because we saw some parents walking. And he said, no, there were 3 young girls that they brought here. And their parents, their mothers actually brought them here because their fathers had committed to marry them off. I think there were 14, 15, and 16-year-old, or 13, 14, and 15-year-old. And so the moms, because the parents had already taken some cattle in exchange for their hand in marriage, and the mothers didn't want that, so they brought them to this school. But then the school said they couldn't afford to pay the fees and pay for the little bits and pieces that they needed to stay in the school. And so they had asked them to go home. So I said, but we are supposed to be saving these girls. And they said, but there is a cost because we need to keep the school going. And at that moment, I said, send them back. I said, how much does it cost? And I remember when they told us, I don't even think it was more than $19, $20 a year. To bring them back, that would cost them to, to get to stay for their toiletries and so on and so forth. So we had 2 visitors at FAWE that traveled from the US, and they had their credit cards and a few US dollars, and I had some Kenyan shillings. and a few dollars as well. So we put everything on the table. And I said, if it's not enough, when I get to Nairobi, I'll send more money. So they said, actually, this will for a year. And the mothers started crying. I started crying. I was looking at these girls and saying to myself, if we did not come at the time that we came, those girls were going back to get married and probably within a year would be having children, and that would have been the end of their lives. Now, fast forward, we had so many similar stories, and that shocked me so much that I cried from Kajiado all the way to Nairobi because I was shocked. And when I looked at these girls, they were crying, the mothers were crying. It was just, it was very emotional for me, even when I think about it now. But then one of the girls grew up, came back to Fawe, worked as an intern there. They did so well. We had other stories of young girls that went through the same thing. And I just could not imagine what would have happened if we didn't do, if we weren't there, and what would have happened to these girls. But then coming back, whenever we traveled around to countries where FAWE had their offices and their programs, it was the same story. It was poverty, and the first person to go was the young girl. And parents didn't see the returns in investment in education in the first place. And even if they were forced to, they would rather prioritize on their sons. And obviously we all know that the returns in investment in education is long-term. And I always said that it took my parents almost over 30, 40 years for me to be, to be an impact on them and on society. So nobody wants to make that investment, but I'm pleased that today we're seeing a lot of changes in parents' perceptions, even in rural communities, on the importance of sending their daughters to school. We're seeing the results that are coming out, that girls are actually doing better in school than boys are. But still being mindful that we don't tilt that scale to the detriment of the boys as well. But today, I think there are a lot of girls that are more determined to learn or to study. And I think also because they felt that they were always second class and marginalized, they felt they had to work twice as hard. And the tables are turning. It's very positive, but there are still inequities, especially on early marriages and teenage pregnancies and girls dropping out of school midway through as a result. But I think it's all poverty related and lack of education of the parents as well.
So, Oley, you lay out a very clear sort of narrative and explanation of the demand side constraints that put girls at risk of being brought into household economic activity or early pregnancy, or just traditional barriers that will keep them away from school. And you frame this all in the context of poverty, which I think makes a lot of sense. Now, are there also supply side barriers and challenges in the system that add to the range of issues that prevent girls from going to school? Or do you think it's largely on the demand side?
I think it's both on the supply and the demand side. Because when these girls complete school, first of all, when going to school, they still have household chores to do. So learning and studying becomes a challenge for them. But then going to school, today, I see myself as an African woman having to work twice or three times harder, especially when I was in the UK, to really get to the top. So it's still very difficult for us, especially, when you are in a developing country, as a young girl climbing up the ladder. It's still a very patriarchal work environment. There's a lot of stereotypes, especially on the types of jobs that women would get. The investment in going to school and then getting menial jobs that are very, focused on for women and not bringing income to support their families.
So You spent some time at the Africa Development Bank.
Mhm.
Tell us about that time and what you focused on, and maybe perhaps let's take a tangent to think about the leadership lessons that you were able to develop, to grasp while you were there.
Uh-huh. Um, I think it was the African Development Bank was a different experience for me because all the other organizations that I worked on was focusing on education across Africa. So there was the Forum for African Women Educationalists. There was the Association for Development in Education in Africa, ADEA, and these were all looking more broadly. And I was the CEO, if you may, in those organizations. Now, coming into the African Development Bank, when I came in, we were fortunate to have a president that had started focusing on the social sector. In the past, the African Development Bank was focusing a lot on infrastructure, on energy, and you know those sectors. But the social sector was a bit marginalized. So when I came in as the Director for Human Capital, Youth and Skills Development, I came in at a time when the president had just come in, and there was a lot of reorganization, restructuring in the organization. And his passion was on agriculture, but he was also very strong on building human capital and improving the quality of lives of African, both boys and girls, men and women. Now, the challenge was also, there were so many dynamics. In that department, I was covering 5 sectors. I was covering youth employment and entrepreneurship. I was covering education and skills, nutrition, social protection, and public health security. So, and you still need to struggle to, to argue or advocate on the importance of those sectors within a wider scope of economic terms, in terms of, like I said, in terms of infrastructure, where you see the physical impact immediately, or energy, where you see the physical impact immediately. Whilst in the others, the returns, again, as I mentioned, were more long-term, and nobody wanted to invest. Governments didn't want to request for support in most of those sectors because, for political reasons, they wanted something that was visible. And I remember the president always saying, people don't eat roads, people don't eat bridges, people need livelihoods. And it was a huge struggle, even talking about the areas of nutrition. But I had a dynamic team that was really committed to the work, but it was like, you always having to push against the tide. And I was also leading a group of very young girls or young women who were at their childbearing age and just getting married, giving birth, and struggling to be mothers and working and traveling in an environment that is very demanding, and having to put on those empathic shoes to understand the struggles that they face as mothers, having to travel, taking their babies with them, working deadlines, meeting deadlines. I saw my role more as a mother hen than as a director, because you were always trying to put out fires, you were always trying to counsel, supporting challenges that people were going through. A lot of them were going through emotional challenges. So having to balance those, so the leadership wasn't just about going out and fundraising for the organization or being visible or the face, but it was also managing people, managing expectations, and then meeting expectations of management as well on, on what we were supposed to deliver. So it was a challenge, but it was exciting for me because it was a completely different architecture or landscape from where I was with Fawe and with ADEA, because that was just education, and you were talking to donors, you were convincing them on the importance, but this was broader, and it encompassed the entire human capital sector itself, if you may.
And so at some point you left that job and you returned to Gambia. Help us understand why.
Well, I mean, I've been, I reached a point where when I turned 50 at the time, that was like 3 years ago, I had asked myself, what next? I mean, while I was working at the African Development Bank in Fawe, in Adea, I was supporting a lot of young girls. I was mentoring a lot of young girls. I was a certified coach. I'm a certified coach. But then also a lot of a tyrant, a dictator for 22 years. Things were happening. We were going through a transition. And then when I turned 53, I was asking myself, do I still want to continue this? I mean, I can do this and sit in my comfort zone and work and, make money and whatever it is. But I was always sending money back home to pay school fees for other children, less privileged. We were involved in advocating against dictatorship. And then an opportunity came where we were actively involved, even though I was working in the bank. We couldn't support or engage in political activities because we had to be apolitical. And I remember one day, my mom, we were talking about all these things, and my mom was like, well, I mean, people like yourselves don't want to go into politics because, you feel you don't do politics, and everything you do is politics. And so when people like yourselves don't go into politics, these are the kind of people or the caliber of people that we will get. So that kept being the conversation. And then we were fortunate in 2016 to be able to get this dictator out, and we got a new president, and there was so much hope. And so many Gambians in the diaspora, the youth, the women were all involved, social media was used to get him out. So we were successful. And then we had this new president, and there was hope because he was humble. He wasn't a politician, so we thought this was somebody that could grow into the position. And he had also confirmed and affirmed that he was only there for 3 years and that he was stepping down. He was a businessman. He's not a politician. He didn't want to get into it. And then all of a sudden he changed his mind. He went in there and changed and decided, no, I'm not doing 3 years, I'm doing 5 years. And then even afterwards, he was like, I'm doing 15 years. We need to change the constitution to go beyond this term limit. I needed this 3 years or this 5 years should not be inclusive. So he was actually advocating for 15 years of term in office. And then economically, we lost a lot of resources, financially, human resources. People were depressed, families were divided, the social fabric collapsed, the public sector was in disarray. And I think the turning point for me was a day when this current president was traveling to the UN General Assembly. It was sometime around this time, end of September. And his first year in office, he was traveling and he chartered a private plane. And we didn't even have money to pay salaries. Government officials didn't have. So I called my mom and I said, "Mom, I can't believe he did this. After everything we've said, after everything we've done, how could he charter a private plane with I don't know how many people to go to the UNGA, knowing what we're all going through?" And my mom was like, "Don't talk to me about this anymore. I'm tired of you complaining. If you want to, come here and do something about it." And then I had a discussion with my husband, and I was like, you know what? I'm going back home. We need to make sure that we put a stop to this. We can no longer sit on the fence and criticize and and say people are not doing what they're supposed to do, and whilst we're sitting in our comfort zones. And I took the risk. People thought I was crazy. I discussed it with our bank president. I discussed it with my boss. I consulted with some former heads of state to provide advice on what they thought. And then I made the decision I was coming home and I was going to set up my own political party and get engaged in politics and change the narrative, because we need transformational leaders, ethical leaders. And so I came home. I came home actually around this time last year, around 15th of October. I hadn't planned on coming so soon, but I had decided I was going to go home. But then, you know, making a decision that keeps you awake in the middle of the night, that you wake up and you're like, are you crazy? What are you trying to do? And several times I got that. I got my stomach churning. And I remember saying to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, I said, yeah, I plan to go home. You know, I want to wait until next year. And she was like, if you're going to do this, you need to jump in now. You need to be prepared to take the risk and go home and do it. And in the end, you know, after several consultations with people, I resigned. And people were like, you left that job to come here to get into politics and do this. And I still ask myself whether I'm crazy. But then I came home, and then I took 2 months of not engaging, just checking the landscape, what was going on. I had been working on putting together my constitution, my manifesto and everything, and setting up a party. And then also gauging what was going on the ground. And a lot of advice I got was that you're coming in new, you're not a politician. You're coming in when this battleground is so murky. If you come in now, it's not realistic to go in and set up your own political party. And I was also being approached and consulted by one of the largest political parties here in the Gambia, because everybody heard that I had come home to go into politics and to run for office. And when they approached me, and this is one of the parties that I was dead against for various reasons, because there were perceptions about this party. And like I said, I have a lot of mentors and advisors that I consult. And they were like, well, if this party is the cancer, go in and cure that cancer, go deep in and sort it out. And this party had the largest structures. They had their base in the communities, in rural communities. They were one of the biggest parties that was challenging the dictator. And, so the whole idea of, should I run for office? Should I go and work with these political parties? Things started changing. So cut a long story short, in January, I joined this party, and they were very receptive. They were very open. I worked on trying to restructure the entire party, change the dynamics, looking for a new 2.0 political party that was not, focusing on politics per se, but looking at how do we change the whole political dynamics? How do we engage more young people to go into politics? How do we change, the branding and the narrative of politics? And to tell you the truth, I'm enjoying every single bit of the process. And we have elections in 2021. There's a lot of games. I mean, I look at myself now and I feel like I'm at kindergarten when it comes to politics. I mean, I saw myself as an expert, international expert, leadership, skills and all of that. But with politics, when I came and got into the trenches, it was a different ball game. So now we're working on, on challenging the status quo and going into politics. Unfortunately, the leader of the political party has been so supportive. I've had so much support and encouragement, and I'm really vying to go into public office. But what I'm doing now is, like, every month I invite about 10, 15 young ladies to my house, get snacks, tea, coffee, drinks, and we talk about politics. Why don't they want to engage in politics? What is their perception of politics? What are they afraid of? How can we help them to go in? And really getting people who have been undecided, who have been sitting on the fences and saying, I don't do politics, and really advocating for them to come and engage in politics. Because if we don't come in and we don't engage, the right people don't engage, we continue to get something like what we have across the African continent. So I'm here and I'm not going back, and I have no regrets and no turning back for me.
Well, good for you. It takes courage and thoughtfulness to make a decision like that, and that the stick-to-itiveness that you're describing is I think what we need, not just in African countries but across the world. And so as you're working with your partners to reshape and reconstruct this party and to rethink democracy within the Gambia, how does education fit into your theory of change? And so what are the education manifesto milestones or lamps that you've established?
I actually, because I've been working on human capital, that's exactly what I've just taken into this party, because they had different areas that they were looking at. We focus on, if we don't build the human capital, if we don't build the human infrastructure, especially when the foundation of what made us all Gambians is completely tattered, we will not be able to succeed. It's like we're building on a broken and dismantled foundation. So education is top on the agenda of the political party, especially on skills. We realize that not everybody is cut out for the classroom. We realize that we have a very, very high ratio or rate of young boys crossing the Mediterranean in search of jobs outside and drowning. With COVID now, schools have closed. The whole education system is just in disarray. There was a need to actually press that reset button. And for us, that's what we're looking at, pressing that reset button and look at a new normal, especially in education. What is it going to look like? Should we continue with the normal curriculum that we've had? Is this an opportunity? Has COVID actually been, even though there's been lots of lives lost, could COVID bring an opportunity where we can actually unlearn and relearn the education curriculum per se, and really look at providing soft life skills for children in school and in the classrooms, preparing teachers to focus on, the classroom setup being more learner-centered as opposed to being teacher-centered, because when we were going to school, it was all different. But also providing an opportunity for children to learn and explore and change the entire pedagogical skills or the entire pedagogy of teaching and learning, to look at constructive skills for children, exploration, cognitive skills, use of mother tongue. I mean, children have been home for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Coming back to start English again, it's going to be problematic. Should we revisit and look at use of mother tongue in the classrooms? Should we look at going virtual? Whether we want to or whether we're prepared or we're not, that ship is going to sail. Everything is on technology. So this is an opportunity. I think this is an opportunity for us in the education sector, for those of us that work in the education sector, to really look at education differently. As opposed to preparing our children for exams, let's prepare them for life after school. Because what we have today, and I was saying the other day, I'm a mother of 4. And my children, my eldest is 31. They finished school and everything, but we didn't prepare them for life after school and the life of work. When people go to school, they're expected to, when they finish, we tell them after kindergarten, you go to primary school, after primary school, you go to high school, or you go to university, and then what? And there are no jobs. We're not engaging within the education sector. We're not engaging enough with the private sector. I think it is important that we start, because they are the job creators. Government is not the job creator. How do we engage with the private sector now to look at what types of skills they need? How do we capitalize on the fact that governments are going to invest more on the health sector rather than on the education sector? So we have a double tilt for us in education, because in the past we still had to lobby for increased budget on education, and then now with health crisis coming in the Gambia here, we have a huge challenge of maternal mortality, because when COVID came, all the hospitals were closed. We were not prepared. We have so many young women dying at childbirth. And how do we engage with those that are not converted in education and start working with them, looking at education more holistically, education with health, education with the private sector, bringing in the parents. A lot of children will be homeschooled now. And it is important that parents come in and also be part of that discourse on what the learning outcomes of their children would be. Bringing in community leaders, civil society, government, education actors, and other civil society members that are not in education need to also be part of this dialogue. So I think it's an opportunity for us to really press that reset button. Because if we miss this chance now, that's it. It's going to be so difficult for us to convince the Ministry of Finance on budget allocation when we have an opportunity to shift. When COVID started and they were talking about children going to learning on TV, we realized that only a percentage were able to benefit from that, because majority of these children are in rural communities. They don't have access to electricity. They don't have access to internet. They don't have access to television. Why don't we use radio, radio as a means of communication and learning? And why don't we use mobile phones? Everybody has access to mobile phones. So I think we need to revisit what will it look like in a new form of education where soft skills were never taught in schools, in high schools, in kindergarten, in universities, where we look at preparing our teachers to engage in more technologically based teaching models, where children are provided opportunities to explore and be more innovative and outside of the box. So we have to continue to learn, unlearn, and relearn in education. And I think this is an opportunity for us that we must not lose.
And with that opportunity, what would you do differently for girls?
I think what we're doing now is there's a lot of advocacy for young girls going to school, using role models to go out and talk to these girls on the importance of education, talking to parents on the benefits and the value added of sending their daughters to school, talking to community practitioners also that insist on, the need for, and religious leaders, the need for early marriage, the need for girls dropping out of school, having that conversation. I think it needs to be holistic. It cannot be, we cannot go on the same route that we were just talking to the teachers, talking to the ministers of education, talking to education partners. I think we need to really have a holistic approach on education, on girls' education. We need to get a lot more women like myself to go out there and really advocate. We sponsor, we support a lot of young girls in school, but that's not enough. I think we need to go beyond that. There has to be more dialogue, there has to be more advocacy, and there has to be more stakeholders engaged. I do not want us to keep looking at education or girls' education or girls not going to school as victims. I think we should now start looking at them as opportunities, as future leaders, and we need to start breaking. In some countries, it's not just breaking glass ceilings, it's chipping on those concrete up there until you break through. And we need to continue, but we have to do things differently. It cannot be a new normal, but we need to look at the benefits, talk about the benefits and opportunities of girls' education, and use ourselves rather than just the teachers, but use ourselves and other models that would continue to mentor and lift girls up and speak to parents and communities about on this and encourage more of that.
So Oley, what advice would you have for incumbent or emerging education ministers and other leaders across Africa and potentially across the world who are facing these similar questions? What advice would you give?
I think the bargaining power of anyone that is in the education sector that has to sit across the table with any donor or with Ministry of Finance is very limited, both for the Minister of Education and for education stakeholders. It's okay, you can't, you can't be speaking the same language to say education is important. You have to go beyond that. They all know it's important because they all went to school. But I think we need to start looking at education beyond the classroom, beyond just teaching and learning. And I think we need to be bold enough to engage with other non-education actors. Anybody going into education, I've been in the education sector for a long time, and every conference, seminar I go to, I meet the same people. So we keep talking to each other. We keep talking to ourselves. I think it's high time we start bringing other non-education actors, the unconverted, into the dialogue and start talking about how can we work together. That's one. Two, there's so many civil society organizations on education competing for the same funds to the same donors. And as a result of that, we need to start looking, and I was advocating when I was with the African Development Bank and with ADEA, of an education fund, especially within the African context. An education fund for Africans, by Africans, that resonates with African education system, so that the education narrative is not controlled from outside. Because when a donor comes and say, we will only focus on girls' education, that country would tend to shift towards just focusing on girls' education. And another says we will only do primary education and secondary education and basic education. So we seem to be going into where the money is, following the money, rather than having a plan that encompasses all, so that we own the narrative and we control the narrative. But we need to also be prepared to work together rather than compete against each other for the same funding, and looking at a more holistic approach to education. I mean, for me, it's that has to be the new normal going forward.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Now, you had mentioned President Johnson Sirleaf in your comments as somebody who is providing mentorship to you. What other women leaders are inspirational to you at this point?
I think my all-time favorite right now is Jacinta Ardern, because she is not just breaking glass ceilings, she is smashing them. And she is demonstrating exactly what it is that going out there as a woman and just being yourself and getting into leadership, putting aside all egos, prioritizing being human and seeing your country and the people in your country as your children, that they need to come first. That's important. But President Johnson Sirleaf is also doing something that is really phenomenal, in the sense that she has identified 15 young women, and I am one of those 15 young women, or not young, I say young, 15 women that are in leadership in their countries across the African continent, that are being mentored by women leaders, women in political leadership. So we have President Joyce Banda, President Catherine Samba-Panza, we have Honorable Ngozi. We have quite a number of women leaders that are mentoring us to become ethical public leaders and to unapologetically get into political leadership, not because we are women, but because we can do it. So the second cohort of these women leadership, I mean, she has a program called the Amuje Initiative. And, we have women who are the first female mayoress of Freetown is there. We have members of parliament who are women in there. We have women who are aspiring to be presidential candidates in the next 3 to 5 years, all being mentored and groomed. So she's, all the awards and the funding that she's gotten, she's used it to put together, an initiative that will support women that want to go into political leadership, and bringing together former women leaders as well as male public or presidential leaders to mentor, to support us and to guide us in our journey moving forward. And I think we need more. We need at least 10 President Ellen Johnson Sirleafs across the continent. And our role now as members of the alumni of the Amuje Initiative are supposed to now lift, in our own countries, lift other young girls and engage them into political leadership and mentor them in that process. So it's an amazing experience, because for us as women going into public or political leadership, it is very, very lonely at the top. It is lonely because you don't have as many allies up there. It is lonely because we are still having to work in an environment that is very patriarchal. It is lonely because women are still being marginalized and still, stereotyped. It's still, some countries are still not ready to have women as presidents. So we formed a sisterhood where we support each other, we encourage each other, and we are being mentored by these phenomenal women and advised. And we're doing the same to young girls. And I think having that snowball effect would encourage more young women to go into political leadership, because it's a territory that only the brave dare to go. And even when they get there, they're still really trampled upon.
So you have written a book. I believe you call it Memoirs of an African Woman on a Mission.
Yes,
tell us about that book.
Well, I mean, I wasn't planning on putting a book together. My husband and I were talking about writing and reflecting and so on and so forth. And he was talking about writing a book on something, on his sports, because he was into sports. And then I was like, yeah, I need to start putting together, I have a reflective diary. I write everything. I journal everything, my highs and lows. And that helps me in my leadership role when I engage with people that I work with as director, as manager, as even in politics now. And then I woke up one morning and I don't know what happened. It was like a computer downloading. I started typing on my laptop. I started, I think, about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I went on, I didn't stop until 3 a.m. I just sat on my bed and I was just typing. I don't know where it was leading to. I was like, I'm going to write my memoirs. And, people would say, aren't you a bit young to write your memoirs? I was like, I've got stories to tell. And then I was just writing. And I thought also when I was working in the international community, in the work that I was doing, a lot of young girls were looking up to me and saying, I want to be like you. How did you get there? What did you do? People asked me, okay, by the time you were 40, you've been, chair of organizations, you've been chairing boards, you've been CEO, you're a mother, you're a wife, what next? And I thought, sometimes people don't, they see you as you are. They don't see that you have to go through a journey to get to where you are. And I read a lot of books. I read a lot of more of autobiographies of leaders that I really enjoy, I look up to, and I admire. And I felt I needed to write something about my story as from childhood. I needed to be very honest in that book so that people do not just feel that everything was given to me on a silver platter, but I needed to share the good, the bad, and the ugly of my story. The deep, I needed to dissect everything about everything in my story. And I consulted with my mom, with my siblings, and the stories, and with my children and my husband, and so I wrote the book. And it was the first time, even in the Gambia, a lot of people were like, there was too much information. You talked about too many things. It was very un-African for a woman to come out and say a lot of these things. But then the book was targeted at these young girls who were looking up to me and wanted to be like me, and I had to share my story with them. But then when I wrote the book, what I got was actually women like myself that came to me and said, you wrote my story. You talked about the challenges I faced in my marriage. You talked about myself being the eldest in a family. You talked about things that we would not dare talk about. And it gave me a lot of reassurance when I was invited to speak in different schools and talk about the stories. And a lot of other women were sharing and saying the same thing. But nobody dares come out and actually talk about it, because it is not African to go and delve into the deep nitty-gritty of one's life, one's married life, one's family processes, and so on and so on. And And if I had to do it, I'll do it all over again the same way. Because I think a lot of women have learned so much from it. A lot of young girls have learned so much from it. And I don't know. I mean, people are asking me to write another book. I don't even know whether it will ever turn out to be like this one, because this one just happened. I wrote this book in 3 weeks, literally. In 3 weeks, I wrote everything. And so I didn't have time to digest or edit. And I remember when I shared it with my mom, she said, I agree with everything you have in that book, except the bit about when you said your husband cheated on you, you have to take that out. You can't expose dirty linen out. But then my husband was like, if you take it out, then that's no longer your story. If you sugarcoat it, it's no longer your story, because you want to really share the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the reality of your experience and your story. And so I was inspired to just say it as it was, unfiltered. And the first editor that read it was like, I love it. I'm going to go for it. So, and that's how it happened.
That's brilliant. So you have a book that captures your journey.
The
How about
entire journey.
we go back to your childhood? What books then inspired you as a young reader?
I used to read a lot of Enid Blyton books. As a young girl, I used to read a lot of Enid Blyton books. And then growing up, I started reading a lot of Milton Boons. I was very active on theater and on literature. I was very active on plays in school. I loved those kind of things. And then as I was growing up reading Milton Boons, my mom used to read a lot of Barbara Catlin in those days, books on the prince and the maiden and those kind of books. So I read a lot of those. But I think those were the books, a lot of Milton Boons that I was reading, a lot of African pacesetters. There was books that were out at that time that were called pacesetters. And because it had an African scenery to it, I could resonate more with them. But reading was something that my family did a lot of. My father read a lot. My siblings and I read a lot. And I remember now in my own journey of going through a process of growth, both spiritually, in leadership, reading a lot of books. I think over the past 4 or 5 years, I've read about 2,000 books on self-help leadership books, reading autobiographies of Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, Gandhi, all these leaders and what made them unique leaders in their own ways, and reading their autobiographies and things that just helped in my own personal growth and development. I read a lot of books on those areas as well. And I just have my Kindle that I just keep downloading. And when you order books from Amazon, it says those who read this book also ordered this book. And I just kept buying more books. And then I was reading a lot of books on Iyanla Vanzant, Wayne Dyer, lots of those kind of books as well, as I was, like I said, on my own personal spiritual and professional growth. And then I got a lot of inspiration from them. So I read sometimes 2 books in a day or in an evening. I'm a fast reader. And that's one of my favorite pastimes as well. I've seen that book, your TED Talks. I've got the same book here. So especially that helps with public speaking as well. Yeah. So I've been doing a lot of reading. I do a lot of reading, and it's something I really enjoy. That I, outside of work and traveling and so on. Yeah.
Well, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you for this conversation. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes when you have such an enthralling story. What parting words or encouragements might you have for our viewers and listeners?
I think for me, the parting words for me is the young generation that is going up now, and them trying to find themselves. I think my message would be more to them, that I know this because a lot of young people are scared about failing. And for me, my advice to them is it is okay to fall. It is okay to fail. In fact, the best way to learn is to fail and get up and dust up and fall again. I think that's key, because people dare to be bold. People dare to really cross certain boundaries because they're afraid of failure. And I don't think if I didn't fall and get bruised and get up again and fall again, I would be where I am today. And I just want to say that it is okay, but it is also okay for us to just be ourselves, be who we are, our authentic selves as human beings, rather than trying to create an image of something we are expected to be on the outside. And I've learned a lot of that in my journey of trying to be my own authentic self, because then that helps me to just be open about things and to say things the way they are, rather than being, trying to fit myself in boxes.
Oley, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.